All right. Good night, good evening, everybody. We just started meeting back here at Avality. We took a little time off during the pandemic and stuff like that. But I'm very grateful to be back at this location. One of the reasons it's really close to where I live. I think it's very convenient and stuff like that for people that are doing this kind of work here in Jacksonville. So thank you very much to Avality for hosting the meeting tonight. With that, tonight's topic is going to be GraphQL, specifically how to host GraphQL on existing REST services. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move over here to these slides here. Let me see if I can't change it, the full screen view. I think so. Yep. All right. All right. So my obligatory trying to recruit people to do presentations for JaxNode. We're always looking for people to present. It does not have to be on Node.js specifically. It could be on technologies that are definitely like related and stuff like that. So I think next month I'm planning on doing a presentation on AI and some of the new AI tools that have come out. And so a lot of the tooling and stuff around AI is based off of Python as an example. So I'm planning on doing a kind of a node related stuff like that. But we've had people that have presented on Golang before. Any of the front end frameworks are also good topics as well. We've done quite a few presentations on Svelte over the last year or so. It's becoming kind of a more popular framework. And tonight's presentation, and actually we're going to do some SwiftUI, some native stuff with Node. So that's if I can see what I'm doing tonight. So we'll see how that goes. All right, a little bit about me. My name is David Fecky, by the way. I'm primarily an iOS and Android developer. I work for a company that is based in Silicon Valley. They're a fintech. I've been a Node.js organizer for this group since its inception, and a former member of the Node.js Foundation. So I'm a big believer in Node.js and a big fan of Node.js. I'm a reformed .NET developer. And I'm also instrument rated commercial pilot, single engine land, multi-engine land. And that picture is me in my my airplane. All right. So some quick history about GraphQL. So I'm going to start off by saying that I was initially kind of dismissive about GraphQL when I first saw it. We had a presentation on it here maybe about 5 years ago and stuff. And there's a number of things that at the time I thought were flaws that would really prevent a company I was working for at the time from using that kind of technology. But I've since changed my opinion about it. We're using it quite extensively at my current company. The history behind it is that like React, it started off as being a Facebook technology. So they were looking at solving a specific problem where they had all these different REST calls they were trying to make to all these different endpoints, and they're trying to figure out, well, couldn't we find a way to kind of combine these into a single endpoint and then kind of query just the data and stuff that we need? And so that's when they started working on coming up with GraphQL at Facebook. The primary reason was really around their their mobile development. And so they're starting to build native applications and stuff like that. And they're looking for a way to more easily be able to get the specific data they needed for their apps. And so they open sourced it in 2015, and they introduced a formal specification back in 2018. So some of the features are, you can use a single GraphQL endpoint. You don't have to, but it's kind of highly promoted. One of the things that's nice about it is that since it has its own querying language, you can actually query just the specific data that you need, the fields or objects that you need in your query. It also has some other features I think are be considered kind of advanced features, like they have the ability to do real-time updates with subscriptions.
Okay, everybody.
Go ahead. Somebody had a question?
No, sorry, I joined the meetings. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. So they have the ability to do real-time updates with subscriptions. So in other words, if something changes on the back end, you can immediately update the front end. They also have the ability. This is one of the reasons why I did not like GraphQL when I first saw it presented, was because you could read data from your endpoints, but you couldn't update or insert data back in originally with GraphQL. But they very quickly fixed that, and they fixed that with something called mutations. So you can absolutely update your data source as well as pull data down from your data source. And the syntax is very similar to JSON. So it's probably not the best slide, but you can see here, this is kind of what a GraphQL query looks like. So if you look at this, you can see here that, you come up with a name for your query, and then you put it inside of angle brackets. Angle brackets. And then you can specify like filters, parameters, and stuff like that that you want into your query, and then you can specify the specific fields and stuff here. So in this example here, you can see that we're pulling back an ID, a name, an email property, and then there's a friends property, which is really an object, and then we're pulling back a name and an email from the friends property. So that's one of the things that's nice about this, is that it lets you kind of just pick the fields and stuff like that that you want. So it's kind of similar, like if you're using SQL as an example. SQL, you have the select statement. You can pick just the fields and stuff that you want off the table when you're doing a query. This is pretty much the same idea, just it's formatted differently. So the output actually comes out in the form of JSON, and then there'll be in your output, there's actually a field called data, and the data is what contains the JSON response. Those results can be cached. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of flexibility and how you can work with the cache. And you can also contain one-to-many relationships. So anybody that's worked with SQL knows that you can join tables together and get your data back that way and stuff like that. But the thing that's nice about this is this actually formats the results that you're getting back, and the kind of the proper relationship. Any questions so far? All right. So when it comes to actually, setting up GraphQL, if you want to like host your own GraphQL, they have a type definition or schema that they use. And so, in the type definition, you kind of define your types, and then, those are going to have, objects with properties. And then there's different data types and stuff that you can use. So, a lot of the primitives are like string, int, float, that sort of thing. And then you can also specify arrays as well. So this is kind of the example I'm going to be using tonight. So this is an example of type definition with some resolvers. The resolvers basically will let you bind your type definition basically to a method in your service. So if you think about your REST-based service, you may have a method or a function in your service called, in this case, it's called books. And what it's doing is we're actually kind of binding it to a specific method here. So in our resolver, we define our books, just like we did here in our type definition. And then what we're doing here is we're calling get bucks in our service. So Apollo is actually one of the different vendors that's available for doing basically for hosting a GraphQL endpoints. It's a company that we're using or we're working with at my company for doing all of our hosting. But it's Apollo, the product is actually a lot of different things. And so one of the things that they're doing is they have something called a federated graph service. And the idea there is that you can have kind of multiple different, graphs or GraphQL endpoints that are coming into your company. And then you can essentially combine them into a single graph. And so a lot of that is kind of over my head as far as, the types of a lot of that type of functionality, but they have something they call GraphOS as well. And so they're all about GraphQL at Apollo. The other thing that's really nice about Apollo is that they make a set of client-side libraries for JavaScript, React specifically. They also make clients for Swift and Kotlin. So if you're doing Android development, they have a Kotlin library and they have a Swift library on the iOS side. And they also have a server library as well. So when it comes to hosting Apollo, there's a couple different ways you can do it. They have their own hosted service that you can use. So you can, for instance, if you have a REST API or another graph service you want to incorporate, you can do that using their hosting service. You can also just self-host. They have an NPM module that you can use. So they also support Express. So if you are using like an existing, let's say, Express server for hosting your REST services, you can add Apollo into your Express server and host your services that way. So just a curiosity here, is anybody here using Express as a backend API server? Okay, that's good. All right. So the next one I want to talk about is Mercurius, and that's actually the one I'm going to be using for the demo tonight. Mercurius is an adapter built specifically for Fastify. So a couple of years ago, I started hosting some of my own services, and I wanted to be able to use those services and stuff for my own personal mobile development. And for those services, I've been using Fastify. So Fastify is, a couple of people that are on the Node Foundation actually built the framework. It's very popular now for doing REST-based services. But Apollo, I don't think Apollo works with the current iteration of Fastify. But there is this plugin for Fastify that's called Mercurius. And so I used Mercurius for adding a GraphQL endpoint to my existing Fastify services. So like I was saying before, it just works as a plugin for Fastify. And it also supports a lot of the other advanced features that you might be used to with Apollo, like it supports federation. It also supports subscriptions as well. So if you want to add a graph endpoint to Fastify, there's a couple of things you need to do. The first thing you need to do is import the Mercurius module. The next thing you need to do is define a GraphQL type definition. Then you need to define your resolvers. And then once you have all that done, then you can register the Mercurius plugin with the resolvers and the type definition. And it's going to create a route called GraphQL. That's going to be your endpoint for being able to do all of your calls. And then there's a editor you can also use. It's graphical. So I think anybody that's worked with GraphQL is probably familiar with the graphical editor and stuff like that. So they've got one that's built in here that you can use as well. The next thing that's kind of important is, and I put the slide in here because I could not find an easy way just to create a schema or an SDL that you could generate from Mercurius. So one thing that's nice about Apollo is that once you have your Apollo service set up, you can you can go to its graphical editor, and they'll have like a link that you can click on that will give you the SDL, which is the schema definition for that service. And so that's not in the graphical editor that comes with Mercurius. And so I basically just kind of came up with my own solution for that. And so all I'm doing here, if you look at this this post, is that I created an endpoint called schema, and then all I'm doing is taking the type definition and just sending it directly out as a text plain, and that actually will create an SDL that you can use. You can download with a simple curl statement if you need to. Using the Apollo client tools, you can actually, and I'm going to show how you can do this tonight. You can actually configure it so that you can just point to the GraphQL endpoint in the Mercurius Fastify service, and it'll create an SDL for you automatically just by going to the endpoint. So there's a type of query you can do that's an introspection query where you get basically everything that you get if you had an SDL. So that's the method I'm going to demonstrate tonight. So let's do the first demo. We'll see if I can actually pull it off here, because like I said before, I don't have a mirrored screen here. So let me see if I can pull this up. Okay, good. So let's do this. Let's open up code. All right, everybody see that okay? I'm going to blow that up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. That a little bit more legible? Did I read that okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. All right. So this is a kind of a quick and dirty Fastify service here. And I don't know how many people here are familiar with Fastify, but essentially you just import in the Fastify library. And then what I'm doing here is I've created a function here called getBooks. And then I have this Fastify get, which returns books. And it just basically, all it does is query that function, or call that function to send the reply. So I'm going to go ahead and start this service just so we can see what this looks like. All right. So let me go back to my browser. And let's do this. I apologize for all the switching back here. Localhost 3000. All right. All right. So I had that right here called books. So I'm just going to come here and type in books. And there's our list of books that's coming back. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add in my type definition, my resolvers, the Mercurius plugin, and kind of register all this stuff like that. So since I am not able to type all that well, I'm just going to go ahead and make a change here. I'm going to say git checkout main. And let's go back. All right, so to the magic of Git, you can see here that I have added in a import here from Mercurius. And then down here, I've created this type definition. So if we look at this real quickly, what we're actually doing here is we've defined our query and we've assigned it books. And those books are going to be an array of book. And if we look up here at this type up here, this is basically a type definition that matches, basically the data that we're returning with that getBooks method. So we're going to have an ID, we're going to have a title, which is a string, and then we're going to have an author as a string. And I believe the asterisk basically means that it's not nullable, but I forget. So anyways, let's go ahead and kill this service. And I'm going to start back up again. And let's go back. All right, so you see here, we've got our Fastify service. It's still working. I'm going to come here and I'm going to change this to graphical. All right. Oh, okay.
I read that before. I was like GraphQL.
Okay.
That makes sense.
That's how I've pronounced it. I may be pronouncing it incorrectly.
No, I'm sure you're right.
I have no idea.
I just that didn't cross my mind.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and type in books here. One of the things that's nice about this editor is that you can come over here and everything's documented. So since I came up with the type definition, I can come over here and I can kind of drill down on these different types. And you can see here, these are what all the different fields are. And we can go back. There's book and stuff like that. So I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to try to type this without being able to see. All right. And I'm going to come back with an ID and a title. If I can, there we go. All right, that's better. So let's see if if I can query that, and voila, I just pulled back the data. So right here, you can see one advantage over REST is that with the REST endpoint, I just get back everything that's in all the fields and stuff like that here. Right now, I may not want the author. I just may want the title to the book. So I can specify that. One of the things you'll notice here is that it kind of looks like JSON, but it's not JSON, the query language. Because normally with JSON, you'd either have commas or colons and stuff like that separating these different field names. And this is a little bit more, I think, natural feeling, stuff like that. So this is how you do that. So let's go back to the slides. I'm going to minimize that. And I'm just going to kill this one right now. All right, we're not supposed to be seeing that. And let's go back here to. Okay. So anyways, that was adding Curious to the Fastify. All right, so for consuming this, I'm going to use Apollo for consuming this. And one of the things that's really nice about Apollo, even though I use Mercurius to host the GraphQL, GraphQL is really kind of a universal. There's a standards body, there's a standards process behind it. So in theory, any vendor could make their own GraphQL tools, their own clients and stuff like that. And so for this, I'm actually going to be using Apollo to consume this into a SwiftUI application. So there's a module that you can import in for basically adding this into your project. And one of the things that's nice about that module is that it'll generate all of the code for you. So I have to be honest, I have not used this on the React side. So I'm imagining that they're probably using like React Query or something like that, or some other type of thing to kind of like generate the code they need for pulling that back. But I have not worked with this on the React side. But they do generate Kotlin code on Android and Swift code on the iOS side, which is really nice. They take a lot of the pain out of having to do those calls. And so the Apollo client basically does all the work of calling the endpoint and deserializing all the data into something that you can use in your mobile applications. So as far as adding this to an iOS app, the first thing you have to do is you have to add the module. And so on the iOS side, there's a couple different ways you can add third-party software into your projects. The really popular one for a long time was CocoaPods. You can use Apollo with CocoaPods. I'm going to use the Swift package manager. That's considered the more modern way of being able to pull in third-party assets. And SPM can be either added into the app directly or into another package. There's a command line tool called Apollo iOS CLI. The previous command line tool was actually a node-based tool, but they recently replaced it with a Swift-based command line tool. So that's just been in the last year. And what's even more recent is with the latest release of the Xcode 14.3, they had a really nice feature with Apollo that automatically installed the CLI for you when you imported in their package. But that broke when 14.3 came out. So I've been looking at their GitHub repo and stuff like that, and there's some people with filed issues and stuff like that, but it's still not working, and they're not exactly sure why it's not working. So for this demonstration, I have it pre-installed on this machine. So then the next thing you have to do is you have to basically have a place or a folder where you can put all of your GraphQL queries. So the way that the code generation tool works is that it actually looks for the schema definition. So one of the things that's basically it's kind of a three-step process to get all this stuff working. The first thing is you have to init Apollo into your project. And when you init Apollo, one of the things you do is you actually create a configuration file. And then that configuration file, you can do things like you can define how you fetch your schema, as an example. So what that'll do is that will create a schema file and put it into a folder. And then all of your GraphQL queries, you also put into the same folder. And so what will happen is when you go to do the code generation process, it can look at the schema, and then it knows from the schema what objects and stuff are available, and then it will build the queries out based off of the GraphQL queries that you've dropped into this folder. So one of the things that is typically done, or is a popular thing to do, is a lot of people will set it up for their compile as a compile time step. They'll actually execute the command to generate the code. So every time you go to do a build, it goes and checks to see if there's any updates or whatever to the schema, and they'll update it then. I personally find that a little bit dangerous because anybody's familiar with doing Kotlin or Swift-based development, it's a very those are very type-centric languages. And so if you do anything where you've got a mismatch of types and stuff like that, you could potentially break your build if you're not careful. So when you go to init the Apollo client, one of the things it gives you an option to do is you can init it either for the application itself or into a module that you're creating. So one of the things that's also very popular with iOS development right now is this idea of, you can just put like specific sets of code or business logic and stuff like that into its own package. And then you can add this into a specific package. But for this example, I'm actually going to embed it into the target for the application. And then the last part is going to be, generating all the code. So it'll generate all the Swift files and everything that we need in order to be able to essentially query our database. So there's a couple different parts to the Apollo code gen. This is probably the thing I had the most difficulty with, was setting up the configuration file, because they have a lot of this is in the Apollo documentation, but it's not clearly defined. Like if you do something other than kind of like the basic steps and stuff like that. So I had to do all kinds of searching and checking and stuff like that to actually kind of back up what I saw in the documentation to actually get something that would work correctly with fetching the data and also being able to generate the code. Let's see here. So there's essentially there's like 5 different sections to the code gen. The first one's the easiest part, which is the schema namespace. That's basically what you're going to name your GraphQL schema in your application. And then you use that throughout your code to kind of refer to these specific GraphQL, queries and objects and stuff like that you're trying to use. They have inputs. That's basically where it's going to look for your GraphQL and how that's set up. They do a pretty good job right out of the box of basically just looking for anything with a .GraphQL extension to it. And then they also have a outputs configuration. That's basically where you want your code to be output. So once you go to generate your code, it'll put it into a specific folder. And then the schema download configuration, this is the part that I had the most difficulty with. That's basically defining how, where you're going to be pulling down your schema. So there's a lot of different options there. And I'll show you the example or how I got it to work with Mercurius tonight. And so that is, most of the hard stuff is done when you just go to knit the process. So we go ahead and do this. So this is what the schema download configuration looked like for me. So, we saw, I was hosting the endpoint URL I'm using here is a localhost 3000 for the Fastify server. And then it's going to use the HTTP post method to actually go out and essentially introspect, get the SDL for the application. And then here I'm specifying an SDL is the format that I want. So it actually will create an SDL formatted schema definition. And then for the output path here, you can see here I called it schema.graphqls. So that's one of the conventions they use when you're going to set this up, is that your schema definition is going to end with a .graphqls with an S at the end of the extension, whereas just the regular GraphQL queries are going to just end with a .graphql. All right. So endpoint or the input, this is pretty simple. This is set up so that it kind of recursively looks through your directories for any file that has a GraphQL. And then the schema search path is going to do the same thing, but with GraphQLs, plural.
Is that plural or is it GraphQL schema?
Schema. So, I mean, it's GraphQLs. Is the configuration they're using, but it's.
No, I mean like the S, because it's schema. Like, did they put the S there because it's schema or because it's plural?
I think it's because it's schema. But I mean, the way I think of it, the way I remember it is it's in a plural form. So the other way I think about it is my nephew just moved here from England. He lived in England for 11 years. And when he was in school in England, it's like they didn't study math, they studied maths. Because what they do is they take geometry and trigonometry and algebra. They don't call them those separate subjects. They just call it maths. It's all just kind of generic maths. So it's all in the plural form. So this is what the output's going to look like, for example, tonight. So here what I did was I created I have an output, and the path is going to be to a folder called a book schema. And then for the module type, I'm specifying embedded in the target, and the application, specifically the target for the application is called book viewer. So when you say embedded in target, basically what it's doing is it's looking for a specific target called book viewer. And that is about it for the configuration. So for the actual calling of the code, so this is actually a Swift code. I don't know if anybody here has seen Swift code or not, but here what we're doing is we're creating an Apollo client. And then once we've created that Apollo client, we're doing a query, and just kind of show the structure of what's happening here. A lot of the stuff is kind of like Apple specific stuff. So in Swift, you have the ability of doing closures, and the way they typically do closures is you can either a lot of people will do is they'll take the closure and they'll make it the last parameter in their function parameter. But in this case, the way that it works is that you actually kind of end your function call, and then you begin what would be the closure with a curly bracket, and then you start off the closure with the, what's being passed in this case, it's the result. And so in Swift, they have something called a result type. And a result type is an enumerated value. It's an enum. And in Swift, enums could take in parameters. So it works a lot like a struct or a class in other languages. So in this case, there's two enumerations for the result type. One is the success, the other one is a failure, right? And so you call that case.success or case.failure. And then it takes in its own input here. So if it's successful, it'll take a query result. If it's not successful, if it's a failure, it gets an error. And so here I'm just printing the error. And then for the success, I'm just taking the result set, grabbing the data and looking for a books property. And then if that is null or nil, and then Apple will call things nil. If it's nil, then I just return back an empty array of books. All right, so let's do the second demo. This should be interesting because I can't really see, but I'm going to turn the monitor around here and try to do it this way. All right. So first things first, I have a cheat sheet. I did. Let's see here. Here it is. All right. So here's my cheat sheet. So I've already done the basically the server. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to grab this command. Actually, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to grab this. So I'm going to open up. Let's do this. Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Hold on a second. All right. All right, so we have an application here. And this is a SwiftUI application, so I don't know how familiar everybody is with SwiftUI, but it's actually very similar to React in the sense that you kind of build out these views, and then they use an MVVM pattern typically for a lot of the development with SwiftUI. But in this case, if I go here and I run this, let's see if it renders this out. So I don't know if anybody here's worked with React Native, but one of the things that's really nice about React Native is when you go to run something, it's typically really fast. Like if you have changes, they do hot module reloading and stuff like that. So Apple's trying to get there with some of their tooling and stuff like that, but it's not quite as fast as React Native. But anyways, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually come over here. I'm going to import Apollo into this project, and we will see how that works over Greg's Wi-Fi. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to add this package, and I am going to specify Apollo and add the package. Actually, that was pretty quick. So that's good. So now I've done that. Now what I want to do is I want to come back here and I want to init this. So I'm going to bring my terminal over here so everybody can see my terminal. All right. Everybody read that okay? All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, we looked at the structure for this. There's a folder here called book viewer. That's where all the code exists. So I'm going to go here into that book viewer. All right. And we can see, that's where the files and stuff that we saw in Xcode. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this line in here. If we look at this, this is the init. And what this is doing here is, oops, didn't mean to do that. So what this is doing here is it's calling the net on the CLI. We specify a namespace. All right. Sorry about that. So it's we're declaring a namespace. We're going to call the namespace book schema. The module type is going to be embedded into target, and we're specifying book viewer as the target name. So if I come back here to Xcode and select the book viewer, you can see there's this target here called book viewer. And that's basically what we're targeting. We're targeting the target. And then if I come back here and I run this, that should have run. So let's go and take a look here and see. And sure enough, there it did open up the created a new file here called Apollo Cogen. So let's take a quick look at that. And we can see here we've got our search paths. So a lot of the stuff that we wanted to do, it just did for us automatically. But I want to be able to download the schema from my server. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to my cheat sheet here. And this is that download configuration that I was showing before. I'm just going to copy this. Oops. And let's come back here, and I'm going to open that up. All right. And I don't know how to use Vim on a laptop keyboard, so I apologize for that. All right, so let's try this in TextMate instead. I was just trying to use the arrow keys, and the arrow keys aren't working on Vim for me for some reason. So I'm just gonna come here. I'm gonna open it up inside of here. And what do we got here? I opened that up. Let's try this. Let's come back here. All right, and let's go back. All right. So here's our code gen. This will be easy now. All right. So now I've done that. I'm going to come over here to the end of this output and just paste in this new section here. All right. And that should work. So now I'm going to come back to the command line and let's try doing this. Let's try creating a new folder here. We're going to call it GraphQL. And let's see here. So we've got our GraphQL folder there, and let's try doing Apollo iOS CLI fetch schema. All right, and let's go into our GraphQL folder here. And there's our schema. So if I come over here and I say cat schema GraphQLs, there's our schema. So now we've got Apollo set up to where it's pulling down our schema, right? That's good. So now we want to do the next thing, which is we want to actually create a GraphQL query that we can use. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to come back out and let's go to, let's see here, let's go to the server. Do this. All right. I'm going to pull this up using graphical. And so this is the typical way. It's like you kind of test out your queries and stuff like that using graphical. There we go. So here's our query. We've kind of tested this before, I think. I'm going to add additional, I'm going to add the author in there as well. Now we've got that. And I'm just going to copy that. And let's go here and let's create a new one. We'll call this book query. GraphQL. All right, and let's try them one last time. All right. Escape. All right, so that should take care of that. So now I should be able to actually come in here and actually generate some Swift code. So I'm gonna say Apollo iOS CLI generate. All right, and let's take a look here. And sure enough, it created a folder there called book schema. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back out here. So here's our book schema. And let's go to Xcode.
You turn off logging, or is there CLI really just not logging?
As far as like, well, I mean, if you get an error, it'll show you the error, what caused the error, which is very. Yeah, well, the output is actually, it's generally generating something and putting it into a folder. So
Right, but normally, if you use any other scaffolding CLI, it would.
there's probably a way to enable that. I just don't know what it is off the top of my head, but that's a good observation. So I'm going to come over here now, and I'm going to take this book schema. All right. Maybe there's a thing here where I can add a folder.
You want to see if you can connect to this?
Let's wait a second. See here. All right. So all right. So here's a book schema. Let's click on that and try adding it that. Voila. All right. And I'll try to do the same thing here. I'm going to add where's the GraphQL? There we go. We'll add that as well. All right. Now we're cooking. All right. So let's make sure everything still builds here. So that looks good. So let's do a little coding here. So I'm gonna come over here and back to my cheat sheet. And I'm gonna grab this code sample here. What this is actually a view model. So kind of show how this works. We already have our view here, right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come over here and I am going to create a new file. And it's gonna be a Swift file. And we're gonna call this content view model. All right. So here's our view model. And I'm just gonna paste this in here. And we saw kind of example of this before. This is a little bit different because I'm doing a little extra checking here. So I'm using the guard keyword in Swift, which is basically kind of like an error checking tool. So, you know, in Swift, just like in Objective-C, they like it for everything to be kind of like immutable if possible. And then, so what they did with Swift is they came up with this idea of optionals. So a lot of times you'll see like either a bang at the end of something or a question mark at the end of something. And basically what that's saying is that we're trying to specify that this is actually a type, it's not nil or null. And so what I'm doing here is I'm creating the Apollo client, but I'm checking to make sure that URL is actually a valid URL first. And then once I have that, I can pass it into the Apollo client and now create an Apollo client. And then when this knits, this is actually the constructor in Swift, use init as a constructor. What this does is it does the same thing that we saw in the example before, where it's taking a result type. Once it has a result type, if it's successful, then it passes back a query result. If it's not successful, then it'll fail and print out an error. So the next thing I want to do here is I'm going to come to our content view. All right. And I am going to add in a new property here. And I'm going to say this is going to be view model. And let's spell that correctly. All right. This is going to be a view model, and I'm going to set this equal to my content view model. All right. And I'm going to do one other thing here. So the content view model that I create here, one of the things you'll see here is there's a protocol or interface that we're using. It's called an observable object. And then the observable object, what that does is anytime there's a change made to this class, you can essentially like publish events and stuff like that. So here I've got this published attribute here at the beginning of this property for books. So when this actually comes here and updates this will basically send a message out to anybody that's subscribed to this object to let you know that a change has been made. So I'm going to come over here and I want to add an attribute to this. I'm going to call this at observed object. Oop. It's capitalized. Observe object. All right. So now I've done that. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put in a for each loop. And it helps if I spell it correctly. There we go. And for the for each loop, it'll take some data. So I'm going to use the view model. And I'm going to set that to books. And because just like in React, where you have to put in a basically an ID or identifier for something you're doing a map over or you're looping over, it wants to be able to do the same thing. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to specify an ID, and the ID is going to be the ID from that property. So now that I've done that, I'm going to create a closure, and a closure is going to be a book. There we go. So now in our book, what I'm going to do is I just want to come over here and I want to put out some text. And the text is going to be, let's do something nice to say, book is going to be equal to book.title. And then we'll say from author, and then book.author. There we go. All right, so let's try to run that and see what happens. And it did not work. I know, but let's take a look here and see. One of the things that I do like about doing development with Swift and Xcode is that I can also do breakpoints. So it may be that I'm not running the server. I'm just going to double check, make sure.
I always think that things are supposed to happen in these presentations, that they the most interesting.
That's true. Well, let's see. Yeah, let's take a look here. I'm just going to double check, make sure that the server's running. So let's go over here. Book server, and let's try or clear. All right, better. So let's do npm start. Does not look, oh, yeah, it does not look like it was running. So that might be explain why we're having some problems here. So I'm gonna turn these breakpoints off. Just,
It said it's already in use.
it did?
Yeah.
I didn't see that.
It failed, didn't it? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Something's running.
Where is? Do this. Oh, let's go back to the breakpoints and see what happens. Let's see if this runs. All right. There we go. It was successful. Voila, there we go. So that worked. All right. Yeah, let's go back to the slides here. Questions? Any questions? No questions? Well, I will say this. I found it quite easy to work with the server side tools. So for taking existing like REST endpoints, one of the things that's nice about tools like Apollo, as an example, is that they have tooling and stuff like that. Like if you don't want, maybe you're not consuming something REST endpoint, maybe you want to pull something in from like a flat file source, or you want to do like a SQL query. That software has the capability of being able to pull in from all kinds of different endpoints. They don't necessarily have to be REST endpoints. And so I found it actually pretty easy to get the Apollo tools and stuff set up. So the recommendation I would make if you're trying to add GraphQL and be able to consume it either in a React-based application or a mobile application is I really like the Apollo tooling. I think they make things pretty easy, at least on the server side, for being able to create GraphQL endpoints and kind of join multiple different data points into a single GraphQL endpoint. I really like their tooling. The companies they offer all kinds of other services too in software. So the company I work at now, we use them. We've been very happy with them. Mercurial was really nice for me because, or I'm sorry, Mercurius was really good for me because I was already using a Fastify service. So it allowed me to add Fastify really easy to one of the services that I was working with. And so I was really happy about that. I found that I had a lot of problems specifically around the client tooling on the mobile side. So I mentioned an issue I ran into with the command line tool was not installing automatically when I added the package into Xcode and stuff like that. That's something that just broke with the latest release of Xcode. And so you'll find little idiosyncrasies like that. I found some of the documentation around the client tools on mobile also kind of lacking. I think it's probably a lot better. It's a lot easier going on the React side than it is on the native side. But that's generally where I ran into a problem. So it took me a while to figure out, exactly how to net the code generation and can get it configured correctly and stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons why I came with this stuff already, kind of already in my snippets and stuff like that, because it's a lot of times it's not as simple as going to the documentation, cutting and pasting, and just making some changes for for your namespaces and stuff. I found a lot of difficulty with things not really kind of documented properly. So other than that, I'm definitely sold on GraphQL as being, a query language. Like I said before, we're using it at my company. We're doing all of our there's only one place in our application where we're using a REST endpoint right now. Everything else, we're using GraphQL, even our, well, I don't want to go into specifics about where we're using it and we're not using it, but we're very happy with the tool. We use it on our in our web clients as well as our mobile clients. So